Welcome to the official React Developer Roadmap 2024. In this video, we're going to cover everything that you need to know and learn to become a successful React engineer. This roadmap is well structured, goes into a lot of details, and also has a bunch of different links to different resources so that you can have everything easily accessible in one place. And honestly, if I had this when I was starting out, when I was struggling to learn React, which by the way, it was a real struggle, this would have saved me months, if not years, in my development journey. So obviously, it's too late for me, right? I already know React. I have a whole YouTube channel dedicated to teaching React. But if you're watching this video, chances are that it's not too late for you, and this can be an invaluable resource. In addition to this video, you'll also be able to find the roadmap on GitHub. I've gone ahead and created a repository for it. It'll be the first link in the description. You can check it out, bookmark it, leave it a star while you're there, and continuously have it as you're progressing in your React journey. So I hope that you're ready. Get excited because this is going to teach you how to actually become a React developer in 2024. Here we go. React Developer Roadmap 2024. A comprehensive React Developer Roadmap for 2024 covering every aspect of React and beyond. Now, there's one thing that I want to make sure that you really understand about this roadmap, and that is the fact that you're not expected to know everything that is on this roadmap. It would actually be unreasonable to expect you to know every single thing that I'm going to talk about, especially if you still haven't gotten your first ever React job. Instead, you should think about this roadmap as a sort of goal to where you eventually want to get to over time, right? This is going to cover literally everything about React. So it's unreasonable to expect you to learn this in a couple of weeks. This is going to take you a couple of months at least, if not more than a year. So relax and don't feel overwhelmed with all of the things that I'm going to talk about because you don't have to know all of these right off the bat. And actually, every single section, as you're going to see, will actually tell you what you have to know in that section. In some sections, you'll have to know everything, and in other sections, you'll only have to know a few of the things in there. So now we can begin. Let's start with the first section, React Fundamentals. In this section, you should know and be comfortable with all of the following. First, we have JSX. So JSX is a syntax extension that we use in React, and we pretty much use it in every single component when we actually render out our UI. You don't have to use it to write React, but it's generally the recommended way to do it and the convention. Pretty much everybody uses JSX. Writing JSX looks a lot like HTML. You're kind of using the same elements, you just have a little bit more rules, but it also easily allows you to inject JavaScript directly in your components. So there's no longer a separation where you have to put the JavaScript in a script tag. You can directly put it alongside your HTML. So the first thing that you have to know about JSX is obviously how to write JSX. Again, every single piece of React code, of UI code that we write is going to be written in JSX, so you have to know how to write JSX. Also, what JSX allows you to do is it allows you to conditionally render elements. So you have an if condition. If something is true, render this component. If something else is true, render this component. Otherwise, render something else. In JSX, you can also loop over elements. So let's say that you have an array of some item. You want to loop over that array and show all of the items in your JSX. JSX allows you to easily do that, and you're also expected to know how to do that. And finally, you need to know and be comfortable with adding JavaScript in JSX. You need to be comfortable with this because you're going to do a lot of this. If it's looping over an item, if it's conditionally rendering items, if it's just displaying a value inside of a div or a paragraph tag, you're going to be adding JavaScript in JSX a lot, and you have to be comfortable with it. Then moving on, we have components. So components are the basic building blocks in React. Essentially, whenever you open up a React page on a browser, whatever things that you see are going to be components, right? You have a bunch of components. They all do different things. They all talk to one another or they talk to external services, and all together they make up what is the React application. So you need to know how to create components, right? How does a component look like in React? How do you create it? And how do you actually display it on the screen when the browser paints the screen? You also need to know about the component lifecycle. And this is a very, very important point. You need to know about how a component mounts, how it updates, and how it unmounts, because this plays into so many of the different things that you're going to have to do in React, right? So a component, it'll first start mounting, which is the initial time that it's rendered. That's called the mount. Then it will update whenever some of its dependencies, props, or state changes, and then it will unmount. And you can actually run code at each of these different steps, and you can do things with it. So you really have to understand about the component lifecycle and how it works, because again, it is going to show up everywhere in everything that you do in React. Then we have the different types of components. And yes, there are different types of components. So first you have UI components. So things like buttons, inputs, cards, anything that just renders out some UI and doesn't have any state or any complex logic. You can even call them dumb components, right? They're dumb, they don't do anything smart. Those are UI components, and you're going to use those to build the actual UI elements in your application. Then we have feature components, which is a level higher than UI components. These components are what we call smart components. And the reason why we say smart is because they actually do something, right? They actually run some code other than just rendering out some simple UI. And these components will usually be organized around a specific feature. That's why we call them feature components. For example, the sign-in form. This component will handle the form that allows the user to sign in. All of the code related to handling that logic to actually show the form and like handle the on submit will go inside of this component. And then this component to actually render out the UI will actually use a bunch of these UI components. Like you'll have inputs, you'll have buttons, you'll have maybe a cart to put some styling, and all together, that's how your React application works. And then you have page components, which is a level higher than feature components. Essentially, these are components that render out an entire page. So whenever you open up a React application and you visit a URL, you're usually going to have one page component that renders out everything that you see on that screen. And that component is going to have a bunch of these feature components that each do specific features. And each of those feature components will have UI components that actually render out the UI. So this is kind of an end-to-end representation of how you use all of these different types of components to build your React application. And I want to stress that this is sort of a general rule, but there are some components that won't fit into one of these three categories, and that's fine. There are exceptions, there are special components that do special things, but generally in a React application, you will have UI components, you will have feature components, and you will also have page components. And then something very, very important about the different types of components is you have to learn the art and the skill of splitting larger components into smaller ones. And I say art and skill because it really is. React was designed to have a bunch of components, very small components that ideally only do one thing, and then compose those components together, give them all the data that they require, and all together they make up the React application. Then we have props. Now props in React are super important because it's what you use to pass data between different components. Oftentimes in your React application, you're going to have a component that needs to use some data either in a function or to render it in the UI, and that data is going to have to come from another component. Be it the parent component, be it another component higher up in the tree, you're going to have to use props to pass that data to the component that needs it. So you have to know how to pass data through props to a component. You also have to know how components re-render when props change. This is going back to the component lifecycle that I talked about here, which again is a very important concept. In React, whenever the props of a component are going to change, that component is going to re-render, it's going to re-render the UI, and it's also going to run all of the hooks that have that prop as a dependency once again. That's very important to know. And then you have to know about prop drilling, what it is, and why to avoid it. Prop drilling in React is something that you should always avoid. It's essentially when you have a component that passes some data through props to another component, and that component, instead of using it, just passes the data further along to another component, and this can go as deep as you like. When you have long chains of props like this, it's what we call prop drilling, and you generally want to avoid this in your application because it's not a good solution. It doesn't scale well. So understanding prop drilling and why to avoid it is super important. And finally, we have events, right? In React, we're building interactive applications, which means that we're allowing our users to actually interact with our application, to click some buttons, to type on an input, to submit some forms. And you need to be able to do all of those things. So you need to know how to react to inputs in React, right? If an input changes, how do you get the new value from that input? What do you do with it? Where do you store it? How do you handle all of that? And you also need to handle all of these React events, right? When a button is clicked, you want to handle that event. When an input is change, you want to handle that. And when a form is submitted, you also want to know how to handle the form submission and actually send that data to the backend or wherever you have to send it. Let's now move on to section 2, working with hooks. In this section, you should know and have worked with all of the following hooks. So in React, ever since we made the transition from class components to functional components, hooks got introduced to give us state, to give us effects, and they've become the most important part in React. Honestly, in React, everything nowadays is done with hooks. These are the main basic hooks that come directly from React that you have to know and have worked with because you're going to be using them a lot in the various applications that you build. The first one is useState, right? This is arguably the most used, the most common hook in React. And it's a hook that allows you to have state in a functional component. So you have to know how to create and update state. So how to use the useState hook to actually create state in a React component, and then how to update that state by calling the updater function that you get from useState. Then you have to know and understand how state updates trigger re-renders in the component. So this is again related to the component lifecycle. I told you this was going to be important. Every time that you update state in a component, just like props, it's also going to trigger a re-render of the component, which is going to re-render everything on the screen and also run all of the hooks that depend on that specific piece of state. So understanding this, once again, I'm really stressing this because this is very important, is absolutely crucial if you're going to consider yourself a React developer. You have to know about the component lifecycle and how different things in React affect the lifecycle. And then you want to know how to set state using an updater function. So when you're using the function that you get from useState to actually update the state, you can either give it a value, right, the new value to put in the state, or you can give it a function that will have access to the pending state, and you can use that pending state to make your updates. This is useful in the cases where you want to use the previous state to actually do something to it, like in the case of a counter. You want to increment the counter, you need the previous value of the count to then increment it by +1. To get that value, to get that pending state, you would use an updater function and give that to useState instead of just giving the value directly. And knowing how to do this and actually how to do it properly, because there are some gotchas that you have to really be careful about, is super important because in a lot of your React applications, you're actually going to have to use an updater function to update your state. Then we have UseEffect, which is arguably one of the most controversial hooks in React. Doesn't matter if you like it, if you don't like it, if you want to use it or you don't want to use it. The reality is that you're going to have to use it if you're building a React application, and there's no way around that. So you really have to understand the UseEffect lifecycle, which is very close to the component lifecycle. So UseEffect will also run some code on mount, will run some code on an update, and will have an optional cleanup function to run some code before it gets destroyed. This is really, really important, and I see a lot of developers not understand this correctly and actually end up shipping bugs in production that are super hard to debug. So please take all the time that you need to properly learn about UseEffect, understand it, understand the lifecycle, and make sure that you get it right. You also need to know how to correctly set the dependency array. So UseEffect works with the dependency array. You can give in that dependency array some values that you want the effect to listen to and run some code whenever one of those values changes. And understanding how to do that correctly is super important. Again, I see a lot of developers get this wrong, and those same developers are very confident in their mistakes and will actually preach that their way is actually the correct way when in fact it isn't. Trust me on this, spend all the time that you need, and please get this right. And finally, you have to know when not to use UseEffect. There are situations where you have to use UseEffect, and there are situations where you shouldn't use UseEffect, and you have to use a different solution instead. And actually, the link here, if you click on this, will actually take you to an example that shows you a case where a lot of developers would use UseEffect, but actually, you can derive the state instead and save yourself an extra render cycle. Then we have useCallback and useMemo, and I'm actually going to talk about these together because for the most part, they are the same. The only difference is that useCallback is for functions and useMemo is for actual values. These two hooks are performance hooks, and they're used whenever you have performance problems in your React applications or whenever you want to prevent performance problems. So you really want to understand when to use these hooks, what kind of performance problems can they actually fix, and when should you not use them, and how they prevent unnecessary re-renders. Because a lot of times your performance problems for these hooks are going to be related to unnecessary renders, which you can use these hooks to actually prevent. And then, just like UseEffect, these hooks work with a dependency array, so you have to know how to correctly set the dependency array and what values you have to put in there and what values you have to put out of there. Then we have useRef, which in my opinion is a very underrated hook. This is a hook that allows you to do multiple things. You may know this hook from having to manipulate some DOM element by creating a ref and then passing that ref to that DOM element and then doing something to it. For example, focusing an input. So yes, you have to know how to manipulate the DOM with a ref. That is super important, but that's kind of basic. The second thing that refs allows you to do is it allows you to reference a value and put it in a ref instead of putting it in state. And actually doing that, putting a value in a ref instead of state, will have significant differences to how you can work with that value in the component. So you really have to understand the difference between useRef and useState and when to use a value in one hook and when to use the value in the other hook. Then we have useContext, which is another very important hook in React. UseContext allows you to create a context and inside of it to put some data, some values, and some functions to update those values. And then that data is going to be accessible to any component that is under that context in the React tree. And this is actually a solution that you can use in React to prevent prop drilling, right? We talked about prop drilling where it's these long chains of props that are passed down. Well, with context, you can create a context, put those same values in that context, and then as long as that component is under the context in the React tree, it can easily access it without having to pass that data through props. So you have to know how to create a context using create context from React. You have to know how to create a provider component and actually set the values within it. And then you have to know how to access that context using the useContext hook to actually access those values in your React components. This is something that you will encounter a lot as you're working in React. And actually, a lot of the third-party libraries that you will implement in your application will require you to wrap your entire app with their context to make them work. So this is really, really important. And finally, we have custom hooks. If you watch my channel, you know that I love custom hooks. Everything that I do revolves around custom hooks, and they are super, super important, especially now that we're dealing with functional components. Custom hooks are what you use when you have functionality that you could probably use in multiple components. You would extract it into a custom hook. You would use any of the React hooks or some third-party hooks in there, and you actually have shareable logic that is reusable and that is separated from the rest of your components. And this is generally a great strategy to implement in React applications. It scales really, really well, and knowing how to do this is super, super important. So you have to know how to create a custom hook and also how to reuse a custom hook. Basically, how to make that custom hook reusable in a way that any component can just pass some props to it and can easily reuse it. Next up, we have section 3, implementing features. In this section, you should know and be able to implement some of the following features. Not all, just some. First, we have client-side routing. Now, it's very important to make the distinction between server-side routing or file-based routing. This is specifically referring to the case where you have a client-heavy application that has most of its content on the client side and not on the server side. A lot of these applications that you're going to inevitably run into as you work in React professionally will mostly be using React Router to handle their routing solution. It's a great library, and I recommend it to this day if you're building a client-side application to use that as your routing solution. So you need to know how to use React Router. Go to this link, follow their documentation, play around with a demo project and really get a feel for it, because you should know how to implement this in your own applications, because again, most applications that you are going to be working in will be using React Router. You should also know about bundle splitting and lazy loading per route. This is something that a lot of these other frameworks like Next.js do for you automatically, but if you're using client-side routing, you have to know how to do this yourself. Bundle splitting is essentially when you split your JavaScript code into multiple parts and you lazy load it as you need. Oftentimes, you're going to want to do this per route, right? So every single page or URL that your users can go to will have that JavaScript loaded as the user has the intent to go to that page, and configuring all of that is super important because that's how you optimize your React application and what you actually end up sending to production. And to do that, to bundle split and lazy load, you're going to have to use lazy from React, which you should also be comfortable with using, right? Lazy in React allows you to import the file lazily and only get that code when you actually need to. And that's, again, what you're going to be using to do your bundle splitting. Then we have data fetching, which honestly, almost every single React application that you're going to be working in will have some sort of data fetching, because you're going to need to get some data from somewhere and actually use it in your React components. And to do that, there's generally two ways that you can approach it. One is the recommended way, one is the not recommended way. However, I would argue that you have to learn both, because learning these are crucial to your understanding about React and how it works. First, it's understanding how to fetch data with UseEffect and everything that goes along with it. For example, how do you handle loading? How do you show something to the user while the fetch is happening? Where do you store the state for the loading? How do you update that state? At which step do you do so? And how do you make sure that you're always showing a correct state when something is happening in your fetch? How do you handle errors? If the backend is down, if the user's internet connection goes off or super slow, you have to show an error to the user, and you have to know how to do this inside of that effect. How to implement caching? Why would you want to do caching? What is it good for? How do you actually implement it? And how do you make sure that you implement caching correctly? It's not as trivial to do, trust me. And race conditions. People don't usually think about race conditions, but if you have a use effect that triggers a fetch request, that use effect can run before that first request finishes, and then you might find yourself in a situation where you have outdated data because a second request finished before the first, and the first overrode the results of the second. So knowing how to do all of this is, first of all, super difficult. It took me a long time to get this correctly, and it's also super important because it will teach you a lot about UseEffect. And actually, I would recommend that you do this if you really want to learn about UseEffect, because you're going to have to use every single point of the UseEffect lifecycle to implement fetching data correctly. And then once you're comfortable with that, I would then tell you to learn about 10-stack query, or as you may know it, React query. React query today is the standard in how we fetch data in our React applications, and it actually does all of these things and more for you automatically, and it provides a very simple API for you to use, which makes things a lot simpler. I would always recommend, whenever you're starting a new React application, to use React Query instead of doing it yourself. However, if you don't know how to do this with UseEffect, if you're still learning, I would always recommend that you first start with UseEffect, learning how to do this manually, and then go on to React Query and get all of these benefits. You need to understand how to do it first and be comfortable with doing it first, and then you can move on to the thing that does it for you, because it's really important to know how to do it. Then we have forms, right? Going back to the interactivity, all of our React applications are usually interactive. You want to know how to implement forms in your React application and how to handle and validate user input in forms. So if you have an email input, how do you make sure that the user is entering a valid email? And how do you only submit the form if the email is valid? And what do you do if it's not valid? How do you show the error, right? The same for the password and any other type of input field that you might have. How do you then send form data to the server in whatever shape the server expects the form data? Is it actually the form data object? Is it JSON? Is it something else? You need to know how to properly send that form data to the server, because it's not always that trivial. Then you need to know how to handle file inputs. This is super important, right? In a lot of applications, your users are going to be able to upload files, and especially upload images, and you need to be comfortable with handling those images, because again, it's not that trivial. Sometimes you're going to have to show a preview to the user of the image before you send it to the server, maybe even allow them to crop the image and get a new image as a result and send that to the server. And doing that isn't really that simple. It took me a long time to do it. You have to work with blobs, you have to work with base64 data, and you need to practice to really get good at this, so that when you actually have to implement it for your job, you know how to do it. And then I would recommend that you learn either of these two libraries, so React Hook Form or Formake. These are form libraries that actually help you do a lot of these things a lot simpler without having to write so much code yourself. And these libraries are commonly used in many applications across the world, so chances are if you join a new project, you're probably going to run into one of these, and it's good to know how to actually use them. Then we have state management, another very important topic in React. So state management is the art of having global state and managing that state, right? Again, going back to prop drilling, right? Not having to pass props with all of the state that we need to all the components. And sometimes using context, right? We talked about how context is a solution to prop drilling, isn't enough, and you need something more robust than just the context. In that case, you would implement state management, and you would usually use one of these libraries right here. You don't have to know all of these libraries. You can pick and choose whichever ones you want. I put them kind of in a sort of order of preference. I would pick Redux first. I would then go to Zastan second. I would go to Jotai third, Recall fourth, and Mobex fifth. But again, if you have a project that is using Mobex, that's totally fine. It's a great library. Same for Recall, same for all of these. Pick and choose whichever ones you want, check them all out, see which ones you prefer, and just get some experience actually working with them and implementing some global state management solution. Then we have authentication, another very important topic in React. Authentication is allowing the user to sign into your application and accessing some parts of the application that are otherwise inaccessible to people that are not signed in. And knowing how to do that correctly is super important, because if you don't get your authentication right, you can actually introduce some security vulnerabilities and actually make it a very bad experience for the project and for your users. So things like how to handle user sign in, email, password, JWT, JSON Web Token, right? Making sure that that's set properly, it expires correctly, it's stored securely, right? Oftentimes, this is not going to be completely your responsibility if you're working with a backend developer, but still knowing how to do that and how to do your part of the whole thing is very, very important. Also, how to handle access tokens and token refreshes. Usually that's what you do when you want to implement a robust authentication solution. You will get an access token that you have to store usually in memory on the client, and then you'll get a refresh token that is stored by the server in a secure cookie, and you'll have to use those cookies to actually provide the user access to your application and inject them in every single request that you do. Then you have social sign-in. So that's allowing the user to sign in with Google, Facebook, GitHub, etc. That involves using OAuth, managing the token, and like getting the token and the permissions for the specific user. And that's also something that is very common that a lot of applications have. And then you actually have some libraries that actually do all of this for you in a super easy way and provide you again with a simple API that you can use. That's Supabase, Firebase, and Clerk. All of these have different implementations of their authentication, and actually you can use these instead. I would recommend that you do so instead of rolling your own authentication, just because it's safer. There's less risk of actually introducing a bug, and these libraries are well tested, and some of these are even open source, so it's great. But again, it can happen that you join a project that is doing this manually, and so knowing how to do it is super, super important, because you really have to be ready for anything that the market throws at you. Then we have accessibility, which unfortunately isn't something that is talked about enough, I find, but it's super, super important. Accessibility is really thinking about the people that can't use your website in the same way that maybe the majority of users could. People that have some sort of disability, people that have some sort of limitations, you still want to consider them, and you still want to allow them to have a nice user experience in your application. And you have to know and understand, first of all, why that's important, right? Representing everyone in your applications, and then how to actually implement it in your React applications. So that means learning how to use semantic HTML, right? Not using a div for everything, but actually using section, nav, footer, paragraphs, H1s, and so on, because screen readers will use those to navigate your application, so using them properly is super, super important. Also, how to implement keyboard navigation. Some people can't use a mouse. They have some specific device to actually navigate your application, so usually that'll work through a keyboard. So like having your components respond to keyboard keys is super important. Also knowing how to add area labels, which is what screen readers will read to actually know what your element is, so that the user can actually figure out if they actually want to click that element or if they want to move on to something else, right? Adding area labels is super, super important. And then you have a library here using React Aria that actually gives you a bunch of components that are accessible by default and actually implement a lot of these things already for you so that you don't have to think about them. And finally, we have testing, which I think, at least I've heard, that it's a controversial topic now. Some people say that you should test everything. Some people say that you shouldn't test anything at all in your React applications. I'm actually not saying either of these things. I would say that you have to be balanced and you have to be smart about how you implement your testing in your React applications. There is a skill to knowing what to test and what not to test, right? Because there's benefits and there's cons to actually implementing testing. On the one hand, you have the benefits of testing, which is that it makes sure that your application is working as expected, and it also allows you to in the future make changes to the application and make sure that you did not break anything. But on the other hand, writing tests is tedious, it takes time, developers don't usually want to do it, and it actually makes your code a lot more difficult to change because every time you change something in the code, you also have to change the tests, otherwise, well, they should fail. So really knowing what is actually important enough for you to test and what isn't is a real skill. And now in testing, there's two things that you can usually do. You can either implement unit tests, which is basically taking a component that you've written, rendering it out, and then testing that component individually in isolation as a unit, right? That's why it's called unit tests. And then you have end-to-end integration tests, which is actually spinning up the entire React application on an actual browser and having the test runner click through it as an actual user would and test that everything is working end-to-end, front-end and back-end included. So for unit tests, you have React testing library and you also have Jest. Both of these libraries are great, they're commonly used, and knowing how to write some basic tests with them is really, really important. Moving on, we have section 4, styling solutions. In this section, you should be familiar with some of the following styling solutions. So this is a list of the most popular styling solutions that we use in our React applications. And again, you don't have to know about all of them. Sure, it helps to be at least familiar with some of them, but generally just pick and choose the one that you like or even like two that you like, and you'll be good to go. If you find yourself in a project that uses something that you haven't used before, usually it's not going to take you that long to get the hang of it, and it's not going to be a blocker to actually be productive to that project. I personally, nowadays, like to work with Tailwind the most, but you can use CSS modules, you can use style components, or if you want a full-on library that gives you a lot of these components pre-built, you can use Material UI, Chakra UI, and Design, and there's probably more, but these are pretty much the most commonly used. Moving on to section 5, React frameworks. In this section, you should have worked with one of the following. So again, pick and choose which one you want. These are React frameworks. It's kind of beyond React. At this point, you've already kind of learned at least the basics of React, and you can use one of these frameworks to add some extra functionality to your app, or in the case of Vite, to actually run a simple React application. So if you're using Vite, right, know how to run a simple React application. If you need only a client-side application, this kind of ends there. If you need server-side stuff like server-side rendering and whatnot, you can look into Vite plugins if you want to. There's some great plugins out there that allow you to do some really, really cool things. If you're using Next.js, there's a couple of things here that are worth looking into. For example, the file-based routing, right? This is now a different kind of routing than the client-side routing that we talked about earlier. So looking into that is worth it because that's kind of how Next.js works as a whole. Then there's NextAuth, which is the authentication implementation specifically for Next.js. So if you're using that, it's worth taking a look and understanding how that works. Also, if you're using Next.js, you have server components and server actions. This is something that is relatively new to React, and it's not as widespread yet in the sense that you're not going to find a lot of projects in the real world that have implemented server components and server actions. Nonetheless, they're important to learn because that's probably the future that we're moving towards as a React community. And knowing how to implement a server component, the differences between a server component and a client component, especially when you're loading the data and how things are actually rendering on the actual page that you're seeing, is really, really important. And also how to make updates from server components using server actions. Those are things that, at least for now, they are best done in Next.js. That's why I put them under this section. But again, keep an eye out for these two sections because they are going to become more important as we move on and progress in the year. And finally, you have Remix, which is kind of an alternative to Next.js. It has a different set of opinions. You might prefer this to Next.js or vice versa. Whichever one you want to look into, it's totally fine. Again, for this section, you can just pick one of those and just learn about them and not worry too much about it. Moving on to the last section, section 6, Beyond React. In this section, you should have all of the following qualities. This is a section that a lot of people, unfortunately, don't talk about enough, but it's really, really important. being a good React developer, being a good developer in general, is not only about the code that you write. It's not only about the React code that you write every single day. It's also how you work within a team, how you work within a company, and what qualities that you have that actually help with that. Because it's one thing when you're learning to actually be by yourself and to follow some tutorial, some course, or some videos and actually build some simple projects. And then it's a whole different thing to actually join a project that is bigger than one person, that has multiple teams or people working on it, and how to be efficient and productive in that environment. They're totally different things. So for example, team player, right? How to work within a team, how to perform code reviews. Oftentimes in a team, you are going to receive the code of your coworker and you have to perform a code review. You have to check out that code, make sure that it's correct, and then provide constructive feedback and know how to provide constructive feedback. That is super, super important because that plays with the people's emotions. And if you want to work well within a team, if you want to have team synergy, you need to know how to do that well. Right, that's this next point here, how to give and receive feedback. So it's also not about just giving feedback, but about receiving feedback as well. When you submit your code for a code review and your coworker tells you that your solution is bad and that there's a better solution out there, you have to learn how to take that feedback, take it as constructive feedback, and actually implement it and turn it into something good, into a better solution, instead of getting mad about it and complaining and actually not achieving anything. It's also about efficiency, right? How to prioritize tasks. The reality is that in a real project, you're not going to be able to do all of the things that you would ideally want to do. There's deadlines, there's pressures from management, there's pressures from product, from the actual owner of the product. And sometimes you have to prioritize a task and decide what you do now and what you put to do for later. And a lot of the times that actually translates to tech debt. Now, tech debt is something that you ideally want to avoid, but the reality of the world is you can't avoid it and you're always going to have to deal with it. So knowing how to deal with it, what to prioritize and what to put as tech debt, and then also when to handle that tech debt, because you eventually want to handle it. You can't allow it to keep piling up because eventually it'll get too much and your product is going to suffer. And then you also need to know how to meet deadlines and goals. The reality of this situation is that every single project that you join will have deadlines, will have goals, and you need to be able to meet them. Obviously, right, within reason, right, you can meet some unrealistic demands, but actually meeting your deadlines and goals, what you commit to, is going to make the difference between you getting promoted or even you keeping your job and you getting fired and having to look for work somewhere else. Then you have continuous learning, right? It's not about just going through this entire roadmap and then learning everything and then calling it quits, never learning anything again. You actually have to continuously learn and grow over time, and this is actually expected of you. When someone hires you for a React position, they're expecting you to grow over time and to become more valuable over time. Obviously, this is going to get reflected in your salary, but it should also get reflected in the actual value that you bring to the company. You need to know how to stay up to date with your skills and actually have a plan in place to do that over time. Whether that means at your current job or company branching out and taking on harder challenges for yourself to learn and grow, or that means in your free time after work doing some personal projects and different things to also grow that way. Both ways are great, and I would actually recommend that you do both of these things because doing that is what's going to make you a great React developer over time. And finally, we have networking, which again, unfortunately, doesn't get talked about enough. But realistically, networking is probably your best bet at actually finding a job. You're more easily going to find a job if you know somebody that can refer you to a company than if you just blindly apply on LinkedIn to a bunch of different positions. So to maximize your chances of getting a job and having a fruitful React career, you should do a lot of networking. You should be going to meetups or events, talking to people, making connections, adding them on LinkedIn, and keeping up, right? Keeping in touch. That's super, super important. You should also contribute to open source projects. That is huge. You never know the people that you can meet online digitally by contributing to an open source project and what kind of opportunities that can lead you to. And also, contributing to open source projects is a great way to help you get a job and to up your portfolio because you can actually show the code that you've written, and that code can eventually get merged into some product, and you can be proud of yourself and actually have something to show for. And then you should also network within the company that you're working if you're currently working in a job. This is super important because employees don't stay at one company forever. And if you have a good relationship with a teammate, someone that you've worked for, someone that knows the actual code that you can write, when they go to the next company or perhaps to a better opportunity, they can refer you and they can actually vouch for you because they've worked for you. And again, they've seen how you write code. And generally, doing all of these things and learning all of these things about React, again, will make you a real React developer. You're probably at this point going to be a mid-level developer on your way to senior level if you're not there already. And then you can confidently say that you've learned React, and then you can start tackling the really, really hard problems. But before that, you have a lot of work to do. You have this entire roadmap to get through it, or at least partially if you already know some of these things, which is totally fine. Again, you'll find this roadmap on GitHub. The link will be in the description down below. Refer to it throughout this entire year or however long you need to learn all of these things and use it as a goalpost to actually becoming a successful React engineer. I'm actually going to be continuously updating this roadmap on GitHub as the year progresses. If there's some new links that appear that are super cool, perhaps I'll make a new tutorial on some of these things. Or if there's something else that appears that suddenly becomes more interesting, I will put it there. And I will also make sure that it's really clear what's up to date, what's not up to date, so that you always can refer to this confidently and always trust this as a source for your learning React. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you've enjoyed this. I really hope that you got a lot of value from it. And I'm genuinely really excited about the future of your career. I'm also really excited, by the way, about the future of this channel, of the Cosden Solutions channel. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a new background, there's a new logo, there's a new logo animation, there's a new mic, there's a new quality. Everything is improved for 2024 and I'm super, super excited and you have no idea what's coming next. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos just like these, you can leave this a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. With that being said, my name has been Cosden. This is Cosden Solutions. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I will see you all in the next video. Ciao, ciao.